Hello, you're about to listen to the first episode of Tai'Shar Manetheren, a Wheel of Time podcast. I'm Will, I'm one of the hosts, and I am adding this pre-recording to our first episode to just give you a heads up that, like a lot of podcasts, we took a little while to find our footing as far as equipment and recording and all of the little different things that go into producing a high quality podcast. And so if you are starting with the first episode, just want to warn you that some of our audio quality varies from episode to episode until you get to episodes in January of 2020 and beyond. Up to that point, some of the episodes have some rough quality, but we wanted to leave them on there for one thing, because we still think they're worth listening to. And also because we went through some books and didn't want to try to re-record them. So if you are bothered by random noises in the background or low quality audio, I'd recommend that you jump ahead to one of our more recent episodes. But if you are interested, regardless of what kind of audio quality you're going to run into, then please feel free to listen on to this episode as well as any others that we have made up to this point. And thank you so much. Please subscribe and give us a review. Visit our website at tsmpodcast.com and send us a message on there. Feel free to contact us on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. Thanks for listening. Hello and welcome to the first episode of Tai'Shar Manetheren, a Wheel of Time podcast. I'm Will.
And I'm Sam.
And we are just fans of the book. Sam has been a fan of the series a lot longer than I have. I'm Johnny come lately, and I've been listening to the audiobooks over the past several years. He is much quicker at devouring books than I am. But I will say, first of all, I don't claim to be an expert in these books. I just really enjoy them. Would you say the same?
Oh, yeah. I was going to say, just going in, if we make factual errors, feel free to point them out.
Absolutely.
Will, at this point, probably has one up on me in the later books. I've recently reread the first two, but prior to that, it's been, I don't know, a decade since I've read most of the others, except for the Brandon Sanderson trilogy that ended the series I read more recently. But other than that, I haven't read the later Robert Jordan novels in maybe almost a decade. So definitely some of those aren't as clear in my mind as the later ones. But that is part of why we're doing this podcast. We're doing a reread before the TV show on Amazon is released. Opportunity to refresh that knowledge, I guess you could say.
I'm excited about the TV show in a lot of ways. I think it's going to be fun to see what they do that's slightly different.
Yeah, it's important to I think it's important for me to keep my expectations to a reasonable level, because, you look at other things that have been adapted to TV and movies and, with varying success. My all-time favorite series of anything ever is The Dark Tower by Stephen King, and I will not watch that film ever. And apparently Amazon is also adapting that, so this could foretell how they do that beloved work as well. So we'll see.
Fingers crossed. There's a lot of stuff that's being developed right now that I'm really excited about, that I'm kind of nervous about. The first thing that we're going to talk about today, I think you and I have been discussing the fact that we're reading the books, but we haven't really talked much about the books themselves.
True. Very true.
And Sam and I have been friends for over 15 years. We met in high school, and we're very similar, but we also have had our differences. And I think
definitely
to see where we come down on some of this stuff with the book. We haven't gotten to talk about it yet. So we're kind of texting back and forth and saying, hey, what if we just did a podcast? And if anybody else wants to listen into our conversations, slightly different perspectives going into this. We're both excited about the TV show. Today, we were going to just talk some about an overview of the series. Sam, you mentioned being concerned about spoilers.
Yeah, and since we're kind of doing an overview and talking about things we liked and didn't like, or interesting idea, random thoughts, probably this episode more than others could have spoilers. We'll do our best to avoid them, but it's going to be hard. We'll do our best to avoid the biggest spoilers as we can. But just know that it's sort of hard to talk about some of these topics generally without spoiling some things. So we'll do our best.
Yes, I think, we'll stay away from the major things. And in general, that will be a rule, is we're going to try to keep from spoiling like really big things, or at least give you a warning before we do. So
right. Yeah. If we, because there's some epic scenes it'd be cool to talk about. But if someone hasn't read the book, we might say, okay, we're going to talk about the end of The Eye of the World right now. So if you've not read The Eye of the World, shut it off right here and pick it up in 10 minutes or something after we gush about whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So to begin with, you said you had some things right off the bat that you kind of wanted to.
Yeah, just kind of a general thought. Coming back to this series after not having read it for a long time, and having read a lot of other fiction, nonfiction, the thing that strikes me immediately is that this is a fantasy series that it's just earnest. Like, it's not trying to subvert tropes. It's not trying to be overly dark and gritty, although there are dark parts, certainly.
Right.
But the overall tone of the series is very, I don't want to say Tolkien-esque, because it's not Tolkien. I mean, it's its own thing. In many ways, especially The Eye of the World, is an homage to Tolkien, and is in the very much the same vein of high fantasy, and is really not trying to be anything else. And having read a lot of other genre fiction that takes that idea and subverts it and tries to do other things, it's nice. It's like a donut and coffee. It's just
right.
It's a refreshing experience.
Yeah, I know what you mean. And at the end of the audiobooks, the first several, they have the same interview with Robert Jordan where he's discussing the books and thing that kind of motivated it. And one of the things he says in regards to that was he wanted to take the fantasy world and just try to make it feel realistic.
Yeah.
And I think he does that without taking the angle that I think more recently has become the norm, and that is it's got to be, like you're saying, dark. It's got to be kind of depressing for it to feel real. That's kind of the normal thinking.
Yeah. I mean, and of course it's inevitable. We're going to have to address the elephant in the room as we do this podcast. It's impossible to avoid comparisons to Game of Thrones. And that will be a case with the TV show as well. And I personally will endeavor to avoid doing that as much as I can, even though I am a fan of both. But but initially, at least, having immersed myself in the TV show, read all the books of that particular series, it's a pretty stark contrast. The author of those books set out to give a different experience, to kill main characters and shock the reader and do things that you wouldn't expect to have in a fantasy series. And again, there are things like that in the Wheel of Time, Watt versus Gott there, but it isn't nearly as unpleasant as one unkind way to put it.
Yeah. Well, I do feel like the thing that I always loved about fantasy, and the reason why I would say, I think when I was in high school and really still today, that I'm a bigger fan of fantasy than I am science fiction, by and large, is because I feel like generally with fantasy, there is a sense of wonder that is very present in the Wheel of Time series.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. And it can still tackle difficult or complex themes without having to sacrifice that sense of wonder. That's a good way to put it. And I think that Brandon Sanderson, of course, if listeners don't know, Brandon Sanderson finished the series, wrote the last 3 books after Robert Jordan passed away. I think he's even said he was inspired by Robert Jordan to write fantasy in a similar way. And I think you look at his fiction before and after he finished The Wheel of Time, Mistborn series, A Way of Kings. And I think he also strives to do that same thing. And so I think, he's trying to carry on Robert Jordan's legacy. Again, not to get too far off Wheel of Time, but that's just something that's occurred to me as I've read his other stuff as well.
I think it's relevant, especially in this first episode, and to bring up kind of the state of modern fantasy and why I feel like Wheel of Time is a bit of a bridge between the Tolkien Lewis era of fantasy that was a little bit more of the sense of high fantasy, and the more modern era that gets a little darker. You also have this other thing that happens. I think of like Neil Gaiman kind of
for sure.
books. And
Urban fantasy.
Yes.
Yeah, and there's other one author I've really enjoyed recently is Peter F. Hamilton, and he writes. It's really a good blend of science fiction and fantasy. Because it's sort of think of StarCraft with the space elves of the Protoss, the same sort of thing. He pretty much said he set out to write fantasy in a science fiction setting, and that's tough to pull off. And it's not. And there have been others that have tried and not succeeded. And there's others examples of that, like Star Wars and that sort of thing. But
right.
And you see a lot of these merging of the genres as genre fiction and in film, TV, comic books. As it becomes more mainstream, and you see just kind of the desire to blend these genres together to create something new, and it's an admirable endeavor, I would say. But it is, on the other hand, it is kind of nice to get a hit of the good stuff, the hard, pure high fantasy. And this is, for better or worse, Wheel of Time is high fantasy, though there are hints occasionally that, like in the Age of Legends or before, that there might have been some sort of technology. And of course, there's mentions of steampunk kind of stuff near the end of one of the books. I don't remember. So there's kind of hints here and there, but it is definitely not a key part of the background, the story of anything. It's just just little kind of like breadcrumbs, so to speak, which is nice. Like, I'm okay with that.
Right. Well, and the whole idea of this, similar to Lord of the Rings, you have the different ages, and this is taking place in the Third Age. The Second Age is the Age of Legends. You talk about those hints and those breadcrumbs, and I don't think this is much of a spoiler, but it's more of Easter egg kind of stuff to look out for. But of course, just the concept that the First Age may have been that it's our age, the one we actually live in on this earth, and you have those little hints. Some of which I've only recently had pointed out to me. Like,
I was going to say, this is news to me, actually.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I'm interested.
Okay. Yeah. Well, and this is something that some readers that I've seen talking about on discussion boards and stuff, they get really fascinated by it. And I don't think it was like Jordan's intention to make this a big thing. I think that's part of the reason why it's not incredibly obvious. But there's a scene, and I can't remember which book right off the top of my head, where Egwene finds something that she says isn't made out of metal or wood, but it was like shiny or something, and she describes it as like a Mercedes-Benz logo off of it. She says something about there's something prideful about it or something.
Yeah, interesting. That reminds me of I don't know if you ever heard of Gene Wolfe. He wrote The Book of the New Sun. Is a new wave fantasy back in the 60s or 70s. I don't remember. It's really hard to read. It's got an unreliable narrator, but it's widely considered a classic, I guess. But it's like that. But it's more on the nose about it. Somewhat. Where you just have kind of the remnants of previous ages, and so that's pretty cool. That I'll have to go back and try to find that scene where Jordan had done that. That's interesting.
The other one I just had pointed out to me today by someone was the Lynn who jumped over the moon was as like a reference to John Glenn.
Nice, that's good. I like that.
I'm sure if you wanted to just see a list of all the different places, I imagine that there's one on the wiki page.
Yeah, along with a picture of Charlie from It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia.
Yeah. Right. The conspiracy wall with all and everything. Oh, it's all connected, man. Right. Sure. That was one element that is interesting, but like I say, I don't think Jordan intended it to be a big part of your takeaway from the books. It was just kind of, like I say, Easter eggs.
Yeah, I like that. No, it's. I'm glad you mentioned Age of Legends and of course, the name of the series is The Wheel of Time. It's a pretty cool concept. At various times, he describes it as a metaphor, as a wheel, the great serpent that's biting its own tail, which is the Aes Sedai ring. And it's cool. I like the idea of the ages come and go. That this age has come before, and ages become legend and all that stuff. And really, he really kind of embraces reincarnation. That it's a pretty central idea in the novels, and that could be a spoiler, but it's vague enough. I think that we're okay. But it really lends itself to some really interesting ideas. So, is a reincarnated person the same person, or do they just have their memories, or in some cases, are they a separate person that just happens to be in the reincarnated person's mind. I mean, he really kind of does some fun stuff with that psychologically that makes for some interesting plot points, I would say.
You and I both come from backgrounds that clearly don't believe in reincarnation. So
which makes it even more fun,
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, exploring that idea in a fantasy world is a very interesting concept, especially in one that is so layered and structured, and it goes along with the idea of a cyclical history of events reoccurring and reoccurring and reoccurring, is that idea that eventually everybody is spun out into the pattern once again.
Talking about reincarnation and backgrounds and things, and really just the whole way religion is treated is fun, because it's sort of everyone agrees that Satan or the devil or the dark one is real. Right.
Yes.
There's no question. No one is questioning that is true. He's sealed in Sheol. Him and his Forsaken are sealed in Sheol. But he's there. He's real. And as opposed to the creator, they talk about the creator, capital C, as someone who created the wheel. And it's kind of, I don't know, at times it feels to me like deism. Like he created the wheel and he just stepped back, and now he's not as involved as the dark one would be
right.
if he wasn't sealed in Sheol.
Yeah, I definitely say that there is kind of a deist approach. There's also a little bit of a pantheism too, in the sense of the pattern itself, the wheel itself.
Yeah. Like how much it's like at times it's like, how much is this a metaphor and how much is it not? Like it really, that's a good point about Ta'Viren, and how like the pattern kind of weaves itself around individuals.
And I mean, it's interesting. I think Jordan was an Episcopalian himself. And I think from the Southeast, which you and I are from, and I feel a certain kindredness to him. And I think he really did a great job of creating this fantasy world. One major difference between that of like Tolkien and Lewis is that, Tolkien was obviously very influenced by his Catholic morality. And you see that just fully evident in all the symbolism and everything, and Lewis even more so. It's a straight up allegory.
Tolkien famously hated allegories and disagreed with Lewis on the fact he just said the Lord of the Rings is just a story. It was
right. And I feel like Jordan takes it even a step further from where Tolkien was. Here's a story that isn't an allegory, but has the Christian truths that I believe in. Yeah. And I feel like Jordan is more just, here's a world.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it even has like polyamory in it,
Right. Slavery and
slavery involving magic.
Yes. And really some really terrible things. And I think the thing that is perhaps most successful is one of the things that also is kind of frustrating to me, not frustrating in a bad way, but almost frustrating in a good way. Like I like that I get frustrated at a character because it makes them feel like a real character, but is when you run across a person who their culture is so different from the other cultures that they are looking at the other cultures and saying, oh, you're so backwards. You are so superstitious because you believe in this or that. The Shan-Chan meeting our Two Rivers folk. And things like that. You see that coming up a lot.
The same with the Aiel, really. I mean, it's very much a clash of cultures between the Aiel and everyone else, really.
And the thing I appreciated about that is, while you tend to want to identify with the Andorran folk a little bit, and they're vaguely European in kind of their general culture and everything, and that
pastoral,
right. So you, at the same time, because you are an outsider reading it, there isn't as clear a line of this is supposed to be representative of England and whatever.
Sure.
You end up looking at it truly more as an outsider, and I think that there's a value to that. I think what it brings is, this is what the world would look like from the outside if these two different cultures came together, and one of them is just saying, oh, well, I'm better than you because of this thing that happened back in history or whatever, and I hold to this oath and I do participate in this code or whatever it is. And just kind of, I guess it shows the folly of the culture war in one way.
I like that.
I know you'll have more points along and along. You brought up polyamory, so I'm just going to go ahead.
That was one we were going to have to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, that's always my biggest caveat when I'm talking about this series. is because I love this series, and it's something that I don't really like about this series.
I don't understand why he felt the need to do that. I really don't.
When I first got into it and realized, hey, there's this culture that has a polygamous kind of property to it, I was like, okay, that's a real thing that exists. Yeah. But the way that it goes about, and we are getting into territory that is definitely further along in the books. So, if you're early on, you may want to pause it here and jump ahead or join us in the next episode. But, when you get into the relationship with Rand and his harem, not only is it somewhat objectionable to me from just a moral standpoint, from kind of a sexism kind of standpoint, the thing that I'm more bothered by is, even so, is that it doesn't really work to me with the characters. I really don't. I don't believe any of those women would be okay with
sharing him.
Yeah, I mean, definitely not Avienda.
No,
not Elaine. She's a queen.
Not Ben either. Yeah. My first thought about it is, it's weird that it's almost like, especially when men starts talking about it early, it's like the pattern wanted them to be in a polyamorous relationship together. Like she's like, I could see that there's these three women that are, going to fall for him or something. And it's like, what, why? Yeah. I mean, like, especially he's in the middle of trying to unite the nations and he's going to have this polyamorous relationship. I don't understand. I don't understand why we need that. Why that's important.
If one thing it does that I guess maybe he was trying to accomplish, it subverts the love triangle trope.
Yeah, that's true.
And that to me is not justification for it, but that may have been some of where he was coming from.
Yeah, I think he probably was, had his heart, so to speak, in the right place, wanting in a lot of situations. I think he wanted to portray the female characters as strong, independent, in control of their lives.
Oh, for sure.
And maybe this was just one more manifestation of that. It just feels like it doesn't work so much.
Yeah. And I mean, it's always the warning that I give to folks. I when I go into it, I was like, I really love this book, and really this is the only thing I don't like about it. I mean, there may be other little bits here and there that's plot details and things, but that's really the only big one that I always put it as a caveat. Like, this has this whole big section, and it gets bigger and bigger as the books go along.
Yeah, it does not go away.
And that to me is one thing that is frustrating about it. That, I think, is something that you have to kind of live with if you're going to go into it. And I say that also as if by chance you're listening to this and you haven't read any of the books, or you're early on still and you haven't gotten to that part, that is something that if it's going to bother you, it's going to bother you a lot, because it's in there.
For sure.
Well, I'm sure that'll come up again and again, and maybe we'll explore a little bit more what we think maybe the motivation was and plot wise and whatever. But for now, I knew that was going to come up. I knew both of us were going to be on the same page on that one. So let's talk about, and if you have other things that you want to inject.
Go for it. No,
I'm just curious, like, favorite characters. Let's just exclude the Ta'Veren. They're
just too powerful, too kind of all encompassing, and I like that. That's a good.
One thing I wish I had gotten beforehand was about a 20-minute talk explaining a few of the phrases.
They're in a glossary in the back, but who has time for that? Right. I mean, I certainly just look at that until after the fact.
But Ta'Veren is this phrase that appears pretty early in the book that doesn't exactly get explained in a very thorough way, but it's just the idea that there are certain people around whom the pattern shifts. It's a little bit, not quite, but it's a little bit in Star Wars, like being Force sensitive. You have this ability to kind of shape the events around you.
Yeah, so a few examples probably would be good. There's three that come to mind for me. So with Matt Cawthon, one of the three main Ta'Veren, anytime he plays dice, he wins.
Yes.
Like and I'm sure if the other two, Rand and Perrin, were to gamble, they would also win, but they don't.
Yeah.
That's Matt's thing. He just gambles. So that's like one example. It's like kind of a microcosm. With Rand, there was one part of, I can't remember if it's the first or the second book, where he's running away by himself and some other characters are following him, and they come to this village where he'd been, and suddenly everyone in the village got married to different people, like all at once. There were like a bunch of weddings.
Yeah.
And so it was just like he was there, and suddenly everyone decided they needed to get married to, to whoever they were into. So it's just like, an immediate kind of, just suddenly this event happened. And then the third one that comes to mind is when there was a negotiation with the sea folk, who they're kind of the sailors, so to speak. They do a lot of stuff, but and he, by being in the room, influences the negotiation positively in his favor. And then when he leaves, kind of like the rest of the negotiation falls apart because he's not simply in the room. So.
Yeah. No, those are good examples to kind of get a picture of what it means to be ta'veren. I like this idea. On one level, like I could look at it, if I weren't a fantasy fan and I just heard this, I would say that is such a lame plot device.
Like, it's like the obvious chosen one trope.
Yes.
But like really leaning into it, and in an interesting twist, like in a lot of ways different than just kind of plot armor, so to speak.
Right.
Like plot armor manifested as an actual concept in the world.
Yeah, just owning it, because otherwise, if you don't have that and things just work out all the time for your characters, then you have no explanation at all.
And that's a big problem in a lot of fantasy, for sure.
It is. And so having this concept that you have these three characters that wherever they are, there are certain events are going to shape themselves to, plot convenience to a degree.
It was never clear to me, especially early on, how they just, like the Aes Sedai, just knew that they were all three ta'veren. Maybe that was explained and I missed it, but I think it becomes clear. But early on, it's like, how did Moiraine know? Or however you say Moiraine?
Moiraine. Yeah.
How did she just know that all three of them were ta'veren? I don't know if that was ever really clear to me.
I think this comes up in New Spring, and Uber fans.
Oh, fair enough. I read it many years ago.
Yeah, we'll be able to explain, but that specifically, Moiraine has a gift for identifying ta'veren. That is one of her gifts, just like Elida has the foretelling, and
it's a talent with a capital T, I think.
Right,
for different people.
Mm-hmm. So I think that was kind of the idea that Moiraine, when she visits the Two Rivers folk, she's able to identify them, and then she was surprised to find three ta'veren in one place.
Yeah, it's not. Usually it's one, and very rarely even that.
So excluding the ta'veren, Rand, Mat, and Perrin, who would you say are some of your favorite principal characters?
So we briefly did talk about this, or text about it, and it did kind of solidify my mind. Lan, Moraine's warder, is definitely up on the list, and is not kind of a perspective character usually, very rarely. There will be many chapters without him, but I've always enjoyed his background as the last king of Malkier, however you say it.
Yeah.
This land that was reclaimed by the Shadow, and his family. As a baby, he was whisked away, and I just always thought he was a really cool character who has devoted his life to fighting the Shadow, but as an Aes Sedai warder. And anyway, that's the first one that popped to mind for sure. What about you?
Yeah, I would say Lan too. I do love the idea. I also like the fact that his story kind of is happening in the background. Even when you get, it's like Aragorn, but in the total background.
Yeah, for sure.
Even when you get to the last trilogy, you have his whole story unfolding, and it's like once every 6 chapters, and
you want to know what is going to happen, because again, spoiler territory. I'm not going to give everything away, but you pretty much expect him to die. I mean, It's like for many books, you just think, oh, he's going to die, especially the last 3, though. So it makes his whole plot line really interesting, because they're like, what is he going to do? How's this going to all end? Because it has to. So that made it all the more compelling, really.
Exactly. He's the first one to train Rand in the sword, really.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So I don't want to derail this conversation, but I am going to, because this does bring up a point that one of my random thoughts. Rand has a heron-marked blade, and heron-marked blade marks a person as a blade master. They're only given to people who have proven after many years that they are incredibly proficient with the sword. His father, Tam-Althor, was given a heron-marked blade of a sword master when he was fighting. It was a war, I think it was a war between Tyr and Ilion, I believe. I'm not 100% sure about that, but he gives it to Rand before Rand leaves with Moiraine and the other ta'veren. And like you said, Lan does train him, but it does seem like he becomes an actual blade master way faster than he should have. Like, okay, yes. I get that he has the one power and he has the void that Tam-Althor trained him to use. You know, the kind of like, get rid of emotion, focus your mind on this flame and feed your emotion into it until you're emotionless. I get that, but he still manages to best an actual blade master. Again, sorry, spoilers. Yep. We're fully in spoiler territory here.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah.
But that particular scene bothered me. Like, it'd been one thing if he had just, crushed the dude with a fireball or something, like, okay, fine. But no, he actually beat a blade master in a sword fight when he's still he's only had his sword for a little while. So that always bothered me.
Yes. No, I actually totally agree with you. I think one of the things that you run up against in this series in general is if you read them back to back like I did, it really highlights the fact that a lot of these characters go through shifts and growth that seem unnaturally fast.
Yeah.
And it is one of the kind of weaker points, which is why one of the things that I think the TV show has an opportunity to do better, do more convincingly, is chart their growth as natural, more slowly.
I like that. I do. And I think that in this particular case, the only kind of headcanon explanation I can give is that, okay, again, spoilers, sorry everybody, I've already thrown out a few.
Yeah, we're into it now, man.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. That as the reincarnated Lews Therin Telamon, and this isn't, I don't know if this is covered or not, perhaps Lews Therin was a blade master or something like that.
Sure.
You think about the way Matt has all these people in his head, these memories, and those give him extra abilities. And we've seen how certainly Lews Therin has given over time, gives Rand better control over the one power, for example. It gives him the ability to do things he wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So that is one possibility, that he has assimilated some level of swordsmanship just by virtue of being Lews Therin Telamon reincarnated. Spun back out in the wheel or whatever.
Yeah. Well, and that makes sense to me. I mean, I think there's a lot you can chalk up to, whether it's ta'veren or the pattern, or like you're saying, it's whether it's Matt's memories.
Right. You
can find reasons. And of course, it's one of the things that I enjoy about fantasy is that you mentioned headcanon.
Yeah, right.
All of us have to have a little bit of that. You
totally
have to have that suspension of disbelief and say, well, I guess it just worked because yada, yada, yada. And
exactly.
Getting back to characters though,
please.
I was going to say one of my favorite characters from the principal group is Egwene, and that may be a surprise to some folks that anybody has Egwene as one of their favorite characters, because I read stuff from discussion boards online. I know a lot of folks don't like her and think she's kind of a Mary Sue. I just totally disagree. I really like her character, and part of the reason why I like her character so much is because I did not like her at the beginning, and as the books went along, I felt like her growth path, while it does ramp up, as you get to the end when you're getting into the her becoming Amerlin Seat suddenly and all that, it does seem kind of fast. But at the same time, she went through a fair amount of development.
Yeah, she went through some trials and tribulations for sure.
Right.
First you look at the Shan-Chan, then the Aiel, and then of course, just going through the stuff at the White Tower. And then, all the mini adventures.
Exactly. Right. Captivity in the White Tower and all that. And the chapters with her in the White Tower as a captive are some of my favorite chapters, I think. Like,
really?
Well, I may be overstating that a bit, but what I'm saying, I guess the thing that I thought was just so intriguing is this whole business of her having to mature very fast, very quickly, and putting the White Tower first in all of her thinking. That was
a shift. That had to be a shift for her. Yeah, right. For sure. As opposed to just having loyalty to her friends and Emmons Field and that sort of thing. Yeah, no, that I respect it. I respect it. I think for me, the Egwene scenes where she is collared by the Shan-Shan as a Mareth Domain are some of the most painful to read.
Yeah.
and like reading it again, it's not as bad because you know what's going to happen. But man, it is. Yeah, it's just like that is a tough kind of like plot to just kind of read through. I mean, yeah, that whole thing is tough. So yeah, no, but it does make you appreciate her more after she escapes that whole situation.
Right, for real. One of the things that you and I talked about right before this was how I've been listening to the audiobooks, and so when we talk about like the pronunciation of stuff, and so for example, in the book they do pronounce it Damani.
That's right. Yeah, and I had it in my head. I'd read it as domain, and so that's one of those ones right there.
Right. Yeah.
That's one of the ones, and I even heard it in the audiobook, and it did not sink in. One did not sink in.
It's super confusing too, because then you could easily get them confused with the inhabitants of Aradaman, who are also called Damani, but it's spelled.
Oh man, yeah, Domani instead of Damane. Whoa, yeah, mind blown.
And so I remember being very confused once I realized, like, oh no, they're not talking about Damani, they're talking about Damani. Like there is a slight pronunciation difference there. I guess.
Yeah, but not much.
Damani. I really like Egwene. I'm really looking forward to seeing her in the TV show, and I hope that and just like with Lan, I mean, all of these characters, you want to see them done. Yeah, right.
And can I just say, like, so you just posted on Facebook today, or the tweet, the announcement. So even before like getting into so we talked about that we were going to do like a our dream versions of the characters or who would play them, and we still can. But when you first mentioned that, my first thought was, well, they'll probably get a bunch of no names.
Yes. Yeah.
And here we have the first cast announcement is not a no name.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I mean, we'll talk about the cast announcement in a minute. Okay. But I do want to say I'm hoping that we can get into kind of maybe in future episodes a little bit of hey, with whatever cast hasn't been announced yet, here's who I would love to see play, or especially when you're talking about like the later books that won't be cast for a while.
And now I'm even more amenable to like, well, who would really be the best, since we actually, again, since the first announcement is an actual, respected actor. So, I was like, you just don't expect that from shows like this. Cool.
So we'll go ahead and get into that for a second, because, and that's a natural flow to get into it. I think, by this time it'll probably have been a few days since Rafe Judkins, the showrunner for the show, announced that Rosamund Pike is going to be playing Moraine.
Heck yeah.
And I saw that and I was just so excited, because that was, oh yes, they're going to do this.
So right. Perfect.
Perfect. That was my initial reaction. And I have been on different message boards reading about people's reactions, and vast majority of people are super excited. And
I'm sure
it's very much an evidence of them wanting to do it right and not.
Yeah.
What's funny is on my list, I actually, like you, I was actually kind of thinking, well, I mean, they're probably going to get somebody from Moraine who's not a big name, but they might get somebody who's good. And so when I was making a list, and we can talk about this later another time, I actually had Rosamund Pike on a smaller part, because I was kind of thinking, well, she's the kind of person that they could come in for a few episodes, especially towards the end if the show's doing really well. But
as opposed to Moraine, who is a central character. I mean, she's definitely going to be, especially in the first book. I mean,
she's basically Gandalf.
Yeah.
So you get into a pretty good idea of where the direction of the TV show is going when you have this very well decorated actress who, in my opinion, fits it almost perfectly. I know some people were complaining about, like, appearance wise, that she's too tall, and I'm like, oh, come on.
Yeah, that's the detail you have to overlook. But like, you always the description of Aes Sedai is that they're ageless, and like, For me at least, it'd be tough to pin an age on her. Like I haven't looked it up. I mean, I feel like she could be anywhere from like late 30s to I don't know.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
It's a good.
Yeah, no, I thought the same thing. I think she has that commanding kind of presence. So I'm very excited about that announcement because I think it bodes well for the rest of the casting. And now it might mean that they're pouring a lot of their casting budget into that one role.
Sure. And that's a risk for sure.
But at the same time, that it just brings the caliber up. And it also, I think, attracts other actors that would want to work with Oscar caliber kind of actors and like, oh, hey, I want to be a part of that now.
Yeah, it raises the kind of the caliber of the whole show.
Yeah, legitimizes it, I guess.
I like that. I mean,
to some degree, it's a little bit like Sean Bean in the first season of Game of Thrones.
For sure.
We talked about it's unavoidable.
It absolutely. I've had to restrain my tongue several times, and so I'm glad to hear you bring it up.
And I'll be the first to say I'm not as big a fan of Game of Thrones in general. Now, I totally respect what they did with the show, and I'll be the first to say I like things that are like cotton candy sweet at the end of the day. And that
Game of Thrones is not that.
Right. Yeah.
There are multiple times watching it that my wife, Rachel, like broke down crying because the scene was so violent, shocking, what have you, just like, what, at some point the TV show even got more so into kind of like the violence porn kind of stuff than the books did even.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I haven't watched a single episode of the show. I have caught up with it through recap video kind of stuff.
That's all you need.
The thing that I think has been done with Game of Thrones that is it has kicked open the door for this kind of genre high quality series.
Yeah, you look at the budget for those last 3 seasons. I mean, those were movie budgets. I mean, just crazy budgets. Even, you look at the last season was 6 episodes. Each one was, some of those were, can't remember the 100 million, 10 million. I can't remember the exact range, but it was like a shocking number for a single episode. And they would have, these battles that would be grander in scale than anything that had been done in TV before. I mean,
right.
It's definitely just in terms of the scale and, the number of viewers and stuff, you can understand why HBO wants to do spinoffs, certainly.
I think somewhat ironically it's also the reason why, for example, you get, as we've already mentioned, a very Catholic influenced Lord of the Rings and the very obviously Christian Narnia series that is being kind of reborn in Netflix and
right. Yeah, I think they're making the Silver Chair, maybe.
Yeah. And I'll be interested to see how those turn out as well. Yeah. Largely, for better or worse, those have come into existence in no small part due to the success of Game of Thrones. It's kind of, like I said, it's ironic, but anyway.
With 100% less incest.
100% less. You can put that on the cover. Yeah. Let's talk about some other favorites before we wrap up. What are some favorites? There are over 1,000 characters in the Wheel.
Whoa, really?
Yeah.
I realized that. I never bothered to count.
Part of the reason, though, is that you get names for every single character,
That's true.
Even if they're only there for a page. I remember noting in one of the later books, some of the character walks onto the traveling ground to go through a gateway and briefly mentions the name of the Aes Sedai that is there to open a gateway. And I'm pretty sure that's the one and only time we hear about that particular Aes Sedai. So when it says there's over 1,000 characters, I think it just means there's 1,000 names.
It makes you wonder how what his convention was for coming up with names. At some point, did he just have a dartboard and let's put this suffix, this prefix, and just throw a random, quotation mark in the middle?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
There's some similar names for sure. I mean, maybe it's just that he forgot that he'd used a similar name, but
yeah. Well, and I mean, of course, in our world, people have same names, so it's entirely possible. Yeah,
hard to deal with that.
I do think there actually are a few times where you have characters that have the same names. Nobody like very minor characters. But so I was just gonna see if, and I know, like you said, I've more recently gone through them. Do you have any minor characters or smaller characters that pop up in the series that kind of struck you as, oh, this character was fun, or I could have spent more time with this person?
Yeah. I really like Tom Maryland for sure, the Gleeman.
Right.
He's a fun. He's not super minor. I mean, he's in a good many of the books.
Right. I can hear like Tom Maryland fans saying he's not a minor character. But
That's fair. That's fair.
But in your defense, though, he actually, for a character who is introduced in the first book, has remarkably little time in there for being one who goes throughout the series with them.
He'll pop out and pop back in. Yeah, for sure. So no, that's a fair point, though. I guess truly minor characters, though, maybe Elias. And again, I'm sort of biased for the earlier books right now, since I've just read the first two and I'm on the third. Elias Machera, I can't remember.
Machera, yeah.
Machera, he is the wolf brother. Yeah, that Perrin meets with. I think he was with Egwene, maybe, when he meets him out in the woods, running away from White Cloaks. And he is this former warder who, through whatever process causes this to happen, realized he could communicate with wolves. His eyes turn gold, which is the same thing, of course, that happens to Perrin. And he just kind of goes off on his own and hangs out with wolves. I love the whole concept, and of course, the same. It's explained a lot more thoroughly through Perrin's point of view, but it's introduced to us by Elias. Just this cool idea of this concept that's older than the One Power, of being able to talk to wolves and fight with them, sort of fight like them. I think the wolves' name for him is Longtooth or something like that.
Yeah, Longtooth.
And I don't know. I just really, I thought he was cool. He pops up several times throughout the books, and I can't remember exactly what happens to him, if he makes it all the way or not. But just thought he was cool.
I like Elias too. I kind of being the opposite end of. I think the character's name was Noel, the wolf brother that. Yeah,
I just read that part. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, who had totally lost himself in the wolf aspect and had basically had taken on all the characteristics of a wolf. Whereas Elias is a guy who successfully navigated kind of this place of being between wolves and man. The two legs, as the wolves call men.
It's a nice subplot with Perrin, where for so long he's like resisting the wolves, the call of the wolves, I guess, and he kind of blocks them out. And then in talking to Elias, and then I can't remember all the reasons, he realizes that it can be an asset as long as he can maintain his own sanity, so to speak,
right?
Like Elias has done, which is cool.
Yeah. I do think he's an interesting character. The one that I was going to bring up, I fully don't expect you to remember him necessarily. He's from the last trilogy, and his name is Androl, and he is one of the Ashaman who is loyal to Logain, and we meet him. I can't remember if we meet him in the second to last book or in the very last book. I think we may meet him in the very last book. I immediately liked this character and was frustrated that we were getting him so late in the series. But the concept of Androl, and maybe this will jog your memory, he is actually very weak in the One Power, except for he is unusually talented in making gateways.
Ah, yes, that does bring back some. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he can make a much bigger gateway than other people. Right. Could make a little one and couldn't hold it as long. Yeah.
So at the same time, he's not as powerful, but he also commands a lot of respect among the Ashaman ranks, and is kind of a lieutenant to Logain. Mm-hmm. Later. He and Pravara, they actually bond one another. It's the first time that happens.
Ah, that's right.
And there's this whole thing that happens where instead of just being able to feel one another's feelings, they straight up hear one another's thoughts and have to kind of grapple with what that means. Pravara being a Red sister, it kind of is it messes with her whole worldview as a person who sees men, especially men who can channel, as a threat. And so being in the mind of a man who can channel and more growing an affection for him make him kind of interesting. And Pavara also. I mean, we get more of Pavara earlier on, and her arc in that is interesting too, as a Red Sister who not only comes around to men who can channel, but also kind of ends up falling in love with one. One of the moments that I really hope the show works well, and because I hope we get to this far into the series, is towards the end when we finally get into the last battle. One of the battles in the last battle is when Andril shows up and Logain asks him for a miracle, and so they make a circle using the one power. Andril then is able to open up a supermassive gateway that just dumps an enormous amount of lava from Dragon Mount onto the army in front of them. And that I just think that moment would be so epic.
Yeah, and that's an awesome use of the one power that's not, the type of thing you expect to see, especially having read all the other books. It's just not the type of, it's like, it's a nice new twist on what we expect, how we expect people to use the power.
Sure. Exactly. And the kind of the strength from weakness, having a particular ability, and the fact that I think Elaine is the perspective during that chapter, because she doesn't know Andril, and so she's thinking the whole time, why is this guy at the head of this circle? And when she joins in, she's like, he's not powerful at all. And then the gateway opens up and it just becomes evident, oh, okay, so he's got this this talent to do this.
Specialized.
So he's unusual because he's a minor character in that across the books he doesn't appear much, but when he finally appears, he has a pretty major role in that last book. And I almost found myself upset. Like, where was this guy? I would have liked to have known him.
Yeah.
And we get a little bit of his backstory, the fact that his father could channel, that his father, sadly, jumped off a cliff to avoid going mad. And part of the reason why he pursued becoming an Ashaman once that was available to him is a little bit of a way of redeeming his father and bringing back around like this thing that had been seen as a curse on he and his father before him into something that was useful and something that would do good for the world. So I just see him as a very intriguing character.
And what you said about where was he the rest of the series, it does make me wonder. And this is one of those things that is up for debate, and really there's only one person that could answer it conclusively, is how much of the last three books was Brandon Sanderson. We know he had Jordan's notes that were extensive, and especially I think the last chapter itself is Jordan, and there's sections that throughout the three books that are. But you look at a character like that, and you look at a use of the power that's different from what we've seen through a lot of the rest of the series. I can't help but wonder, is Andril, in general, and maybe you can answer this, was he a character, one, in the books before the last trilogy, and two, was this a plot line and a general kind of fleshed out concept that was 100% Sanderson, or did this come from Jordan? It's the sort of thing that it does strike me that there are some real differences in the last three books, despite the fact that he did just knocked it out of the park, stellar job. But, it makes me wonder if that's one of the ways he sort of made it his own. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, this doesn't fully answer that question at all.
Fair enough. That was almost rhetorical, really.
Right. But I do have the Wheel of Time wiki pulled up in front of me for some of these kinds of things that come up. And Andril first appears in Winter's Heart in the prologue.
Okay, he did. Okay, all right.
So he does appear in the earlier books, but it does make you wonder when he comes back in such a major way. Was that Robert Jordan's intention for him, or was Brandon Sanderson kind of looking at, here's a character that gets mentioned.
Yeah,
I just want to expand on that in a major way and really look into okay, here's a character I can kind of make my own.
Sure, as opposed to just pulling one whole cloth out of the air. I like that thought. That makes sense to me. That he wants to still respect the fact that Jordan has created these characters, but perhaps maybe did take that opportunity to sort of make his own mark. And I mean, there's no avoiding that. I mean, he said that in writing the trilogy that he had to flesh it out a lot and sort of make his own decisions. He said he attempted to write in a style that emulated Jordan, but didn't mimic it. Wasn't just parroting what he would expect Jordan to say, like being true to the books while still writing in his own way. And I think he did a good job of that for sure.
Yeah. Well, and I think I've told you, I don't know, maybe I haven't. I may enjoy the last 3 books more than the rest of the series.
I do too.
At least as much. But I think some of the reasoning in that is with Brandon Sanderson being a fan first.
For sure.
I think that he approaches it much the same way that if I were as good a writer as he was, that I would want to approach these characters and really give them all these epic moments to shine. Like, I feel like the awesomeness of the characters is like turned up to 11.
Yeah. I mean, and that's something Sanderson does really well. I mean, in his own books too, the kind of climactic epic endings, like he does that so well, and he did that really well in these books. And, really he set out to write a single book and found that he couldn't. And I think that part of the reason he did such a good job and did these characters justice is because he did a trilogy of 3 as opposed to just trying to cram it all into one book.
And I think it succeeds too, because you look at the 3 books and at first you can say, oh, yeah, cynically, oh, he just wanted to write more books and maybe make more money. But then you get into them and you realize, no, he probably could have written a 4th book if he really wanted to.
Yeah, he could have.
Especially if you get into this. A Memory of Light has so much new stuff in it.
It does. It really does. Yeah.
When you get into it, the Sharans and all of that, and it's not just a little bit. It's not just a little taste. You get a fair amount, and so you get this feeling of this big epic other whole section of the world that is now involved in this conflict. And so, what's the dog's name?
Sophie. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate having Sophie as a guest on the podcast today.
She doesn't normally bark like this. She just knows I'm on the podcast. So
yes. Any other thoughts on your favorite moments, characters, components of this?
I do have 2 thoughts. These are just sort of random musings, I guess you'd call them. One that confused me for the longest time, so I finally looked it up and realized it's just there's the true source versus the true power.
Oh, yes.
The true source is just another name for the one power that the Aes Sedai use periodically, like touching the true source. The true power is, I think, channeling the Dark One directly.
Yes.
But I just want the Forsaken to come up with another name.
Yes.
Because it is too confusing.
Yes. No, that's a good point. And I do think that, I mean, we'll talk about a few times, I'm sure, along where we feel like, Robert Jordan didn't quite get the whole world building right. But I feel like that was one where maybe later on, I feel like he realized that, I don't know what to call this, or there is this other, maybe that concept wasn't one that came to him right at the beginning.
Right.
And so that's part of the reason why, because in the first few books, there are times where I do think they refer to the one power even as the true power.
They may very well. Yeah. Especially in the first book where the whole magic system isn't so super fleshed out. I mean, it's you see it being used, but you don't hear them talking about weaving air and water and spirit and fire. It's just Moraine cast a fireball, or, Rand saw cord of power connected to the Forsaken, and severed it or whatever.
Right.
So
yeah, and part of that is it's told from the perspective of the Two Rivers folk, largely.
True. So I'm sure if it had been from Moraine's perspective, we would have had that. So I think it was sort of conveniently done that way, and he and it may be he had it fully fleshed out at that point, or he might not have had, and it would have been okay that he didn't, because just because it wasn't that important to that book. Really,
Yeah.
that's another detail for sure. So the other thought, it was in the most recent book. I was listening to the audiobook, and there was a line that I just was driving my car, and it made me laugh. Hunger gnawed at Matt like he'd swallowed weasels. So it's like, well played, Robert Jordan. Anyway, that's my thoughts.
There are some really great wordsmithing and funny things. One of the running gags that I appreciate throughout the whole series, that's more present in the early books for obvious reasons, is the whole "I wish Perrin were here. He always knows how to talk to girls. I wish Matt were here. He always
all three,
how to talk to girls. I Rand always seems so comfortable around girls. All three of them think that the other two are better at talking to women, and they all have those thoughts. And of course, the funny thing is that I do think that's something a lot of guys just kind of tend to think, oh, this guy, he really knows how to talk to women, and
for sure
he's over there thinking, I have no idea what to do.
Exactly. Yeah, no, that's a good.
That's one of those little funny reoccurring things with the writing.
That and the braid tugging among other things.
Yes, the braid tugging. Yes.
There better be braid tugging in the TV show. Dang it.
Yes, skirt straightening.
Yes. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. When some announcement was made, I saw on like a Reddit post or something, the top comment was "braid tugging intensifies."
Yeah.
I was like, yes, indeed. One of the things that I really enjoy about Brandon Sanderson is I feel like he embraced the comedic aspects more fully. And I don't know, maybe some other fans will come along and point out to me where I'm wrong. But I love, for example, the whole scene in, I think it's Gathering Storm, where Matt is preparing this whole elaborate plan of how to approach somebody in a tavern that is carrying around a picture of him. And he's with his kind of entourage, and he is preparing a backstory for each one of them as to where they've been and what they're doing. And there's this whole thing about, oh, you are a warder. Oh, well, where's my Aes Sedai? Well, they think that's suspicious and all this thing. Oh, well, no, forget about that. Then he's like saying to this, you had to come this way because you're ailing aunt. And he's like, oh, well, doesn't that make me sound like a jerk if I left my ailing aunt? And he forget about the ailing aunt. There's this whole scene that's just a funny thing of him trying to coordinate these fake stories so they can just walk into a tavern together.
Right.
And then before they even get a chance to, Varen comes out and it's her that has been looking for him. And so the whole thing was just a waste. And it was the first time that I can remember that there was a scene that really in the end was just for comedy. And that was something that I really enjoyed, that I feel like happened a few more times with Brandon Sanderson. Now, some people may look at that and be frustrated at it and feel like he doesn't take it as seriously or maybe
or something.
Yeah, I enjoy it. I
love it. No, I'm with you. I definitely I like the thought that he would, spend time just for that purpose, on a scene, as opposed to just being a peripheral moment in a scene that has another purpose.
Yeah. And I mean, at the same time, there are things where I feel like Sanderson may have done things slightly different with characters that I can see later on. And I think it's in A Memory of Light when Egwene and Tuon finally are face to face, and the whole time Matt is there, and it takes Egwene a little while to recognize him. This was one of these things where I had to go into headcanon too, because the idea that Matt would be totally silent throughout this whole exchange.
Right. No.
With the character that we had up to that point. And so in my headcanon, I could hear Matt's inner monologue being, you know what? I just want to stay out of this.
Right.
I really don't want to get in between these two. I don't like Aes Sedai, and I don't like nobles, and this is basically an Aes Sedai and a noble fighting, and I don't really want to get into that. And that was the way I kind of rescued it with my headcanon. But I do feel like that was one of those times where when I hear people say things like, Sanderson didn't understand Matt, I can understand where they come from on that. Next time you want to just jump into Eye of the World and
sounds good to me. Yeah, absolutely.
Talk a little bit about that first book, and so we will come ready to do that. And so if you enjoyed this, God bless you.
We enjoyed it.
We enjoyed it. You can always like and comment, and if we really suck at it, you can also even tell us how we could do better.
Yeah, please tell me how I got facts wrong. I would
and if
welcome it.
Mispronounce things or whatever.
Yeah, right.
I'd be glad to hear about that. So like, comment, rate us, whatever, 1 star. We don't care. We're not in this for the ratings.
Keeping the day job.
Yes. Anyway, and until next time, Tai'Shar Manetheren.